Aujourd'hui, I will speak about corruption, conflicts of interest, and institutional corruption. So let's start with, but let me just say, if any of you want the PowerPoints or slides, I can give them to you with bibliography afterward, or you can get them from Micheline. Let's start, before we get to the three concepts, with a couple of examples. Take the case of oseltamivir Tamiflu. There were clinical trials that Roche sponsored, 40 of them. They were favorable. It seemed the FDA and EMA approved oseltamivir to prevent and treat seasonal flu. The WHO then recommended that nations stockpile it. Roche made over $19 billion, $18 billion, 9 of it from stockpiling. But it was pointed out then that the favorable analysis was based on studies that didn't have access to the original data. There was huge battle to get access to the data. And then the subsequent Cochrane collaboration after its initial one that wasn't based on data showed very different results. There was only a small reduction of symptoms, and there were significant neuropsychiatric adverse events. It was pointed out there were problems with the methodology of the studies and critique of the WHO and national regulatory authorities for their financial ties that were not disclosed with Roche. So this raised two important questions. Is the science on which decisions made reliable? And second, has public policy been corrupted by those financial ties? A second example, closer to home in the US, treatment of Lyme's disease. There were two competing treatment modalities adopted by different medical societies, and one became dominant. The significance was that reimbursement was based on the treatment guidelines that was adopted. So if the guideline wasn't adopted, there wasn't reimbursement for that. There was an investigation by the Attorney General of Connecticut who found that there was anti-competitive practices. And they found that, the Attorney General found that the board had conflicts of interest that did these studies. They required redoing the guidelines. There was an appointment of a expert in ethics, Dr. Brody from University of Texas, who's written a lot on conflicts of interest, and an entirely new panel was convened. And surprisingly though, after a year work, after over 16 meetings, they came up with essentially the same conclusion, even though the earlier panel had conflicts of interest. So conflict of interest doesn't necessarily mean that the results are corrupted or different, but it is a risk factor. In the COVID era, there have been questions and charges about conflicts of interest in many areas. In the US, quite notably, the decisions of federal officials on contracting for production of vaccine and waiving of public access and rights and the financing was perhaps influenced by the fact that there were financial ties by those who were making the decisions and the companies in which they hired. There were questions about FDA advisors and similar questions raised about advisors for policy in the UK. And of course, in France, Dr. Rouelle and colleagues were interested and wrote very articulately about the decisions of the statements of physicians on the effectiveness of certain treatments. They found that there was a strong association, but whether physicians had received funding from Gilead Sciences and critical statements about hydroxy, can never say it, hydroxychloroquine. And so those two raises questions. So just to give you some example of where we're talking about, and now let me go to these three concepts to see if this might reveal or illuminate something. Corruption, separate from conflicts of interest, and a newer idea, institutional corruption. So classic corruption involves bribes, dishonesty, fraud, violations of governing norms, typically to serve private interests. The dictionaries define it as dishonest or illegal behavior, especially by powerful people or government officials, inducements to wrong by unlawful means, departure from the original or from what is correct. Conflicts of interest are not corruption, although I'll show later, sometimes you can change corrupt activities by changing the financial arrangements into those that are legal, but are conflicts of interest. This is a legal concept developed in Anglo-American law over the last 150 years, particularly in the law of trusts, in finance and securities market, more recently developed in public employment law, and very, very recently in law. The US National Academy of Medicine, Institute of Medicine has adopted a definition that's a little bit at variance. Dennis Thompson, a philosopher at Harvard, came up with this approach, calls conflicts of interest a set of conditions in which professional judgment concerning a primary interest tends to be unduly influenced by a secondary interest, such as financial gain. Now, there's a whole debate in others, people defining conflicts of interest, potential conflicts of interest, actual conflicts of interest, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but I have an article on attempts to redefine conflicts of interest. In France, there's a lot of debate about so-called intellectual conflicts. I'm very skeptical of that concept and think that it's an attempt by some, not by all, to basically defang and get rid of conflicts of interest and saying everyone's have a conflict, but separate issue. Let's go back to the example of the patient-doctor relationship and use that as a point of analysis. One can have a similar analysis for researcher or advisor, but I like to think about the physician working for the patient as the primary paradigm. So patients have a reliance relation on physicians for them to act in their needs. Society has created, expects that physicians do so and has created legal and ethical duties that they do. The problem is that at the same time this occurs, physicians earn their income in ways that can enhance their own income. And when physicians prescribe drugs, make referrals, or other clinical choices, they can affect the fortunes of third parties, providers, firms, hospitals, insurers. All of those parties would like the physician to act in ways that help their interests and try to convince them, sometimes by financial ties, to do so. So you have the physician between other caregivers, and that creates issues of divided loyalties. I think I should maybe go back and go back to the legal definition that I missed before. I didn't mention it, but the law traditionally has defined conflicts of interest as existing when the actor has defined legal duties and at the same time has a financial incentive to breach those obligations or divided loyalties in two different ways. So What a conflict of interest is, in a kind of medical term, I think, is an avoidable risk factor. It is a situation that creates risk. And I think the key lesson we should have is that society can arrange its institutions, its finances, its laws to avoid those risks. And when it can't, it can at least counter those risks when they can't be avoided. So keep that idea in mind. Conflict of interest as an avoidable risk factor. Now, a couple of illustrations from cartoons that might make this more concrete. Here's a private clinic in France with the doctor saying, cette masse noire, c'est votre portefeuille, nous allons faire une ablution dès que possible. Daumier, the doctor who prescribes, who dispenses medicine, ne plaisantez pas avec cette maladie, buvez de l'eau et frottez vos jambes avec cet médicament et revenez me voir souvent. Mes consultations sont gratuites. Vous me devez 20 francs pour ces 2 bouteilles. Et on reprend le verre. So this is the classic kind of financial interest in medicine, still present in many parts of Switzerland, in Japan, where the doctor dispenses medicine. In fact, here I have a book that looked at Japan, France, and the United States. Here's an illustration. The doctor is effecting a medical purge. Look what's being vomited, coins for the doctor. So this is kind of even kind of understood to be an issue going back in time and across cultures as a potential problem. Here in the US, the doctor, déclaration d'intérêt, says to the patient, this medication can cause weight gain. Patient, how so? The pharmaceutical firm wines and dines me for prescribing it. Here you have this institution's affected, change the F to a P, and formation médicale continue devient promotion médicale continue. Here you see this, the effect on institutions. L'ordre des médecins and pharma as co-joint twins. Une telle fusion d'intérêts, nous pouvions envisager une séparation chirurgicale, mais il est peu probable que l'un survive sans l'autre. I don't mean to pick on l'ordre des médecins. We have the same problem in the US, and there's a long history of that too. Okay, and here the doctor as a race car driver with sponsorships written all over his costumes. So this has entered into popular culture. The medication process is a long process to get from development to the medicine to the patient's mouth. And at each stage, there are critical decisions that are affected by physicians and other actors, which the pharmaceutical firm and others are following because they can be blockage points. And these are areas where there can be conflicts of interest, from the point on research to the safety and testing of a drug, to the registration, selection, reimbursement, and pricing, continuing through the development of medical practice guidelines, including the drug on the hospital or insurer formulary, the development of continuing medication, of course, prescribing decisions, dispensing, and pharmacovigilance afterwards. Am I not going too fast? Raise your hand if you can't understand or hear me. So if from the point of view of public policy, I have a little article on viewing this as a public management guide. Where can one intervene from the point of view of a public sector to address these problems? One model I like to use is simply to look at before, during, and after. You can try to prevent the problem through conflict of interest before the physician or other actor involved that has a conflict acts by prohibiting entering into the conflict of interest situation. If that's not available or desirable, cost effective, one can try to avoid the breach of trust or judgment by removing discretion, by requiring the doctors act in certain ways, by supervising them and so there's less chance of acting inappropriately. And a third approach is to think about penalties for misconduct. Don't worry about the conflict. Take a penalty if the conflict results from some activity. Hopefully, that will also deter conduct. And of course, once one gets into the legal mechanics and the like, within each approach, there's a lot of detail. I want to focus 1 minute on something that I think is a real a problem, and that is how people have fastened on this idea of disclosing conflicts of interest before it acts and acting as if it is a cure, which it is not. At least I don't think so. And I think l'Agence de Médicaments got it right. Prescrire that wrote this. Conflit avoué, conflit oublié. Disposed of, forgotten, ignored, passed over, what you want. And in fact, I've written on this. One of my first articles was a 1989 article on the limitations of disclosure of conflicts of interest in the New England Journal of Medicine. I looked at disclosure in multiple contexts, whether it was security markets or other areas, because we often do it. And since Brandeis wrote about transparency being the best sunshine, the best disinfection, it's an interest in the US too. But in most of these other contexts, it works because it's part of an ecology that involves oversight and the like. You can't simply have disclosure and this to be self-effectuating, and problems will take care of themselves. And since that's been written in the last 30 years, there's a very developed literature on psychology of people, whether it gives people license when they disclose to act inappropriately, whether disclosure gets people to lay down their guard and thinking it's all right, and experiments on psychology to see that happens. It's a useful tool, disclosure, particularly if you want to identify a relation that needs to be subject to further information. You can't, unless you see there's a financial tie, be aware that there might be a problem. Disclosure required might help you see that, but the disclosure itself is insufficient to do very much, except help journalists write articles and point out that there's a problem, which is something worth doing, but again, not sufficient. Let me pass to the second idea, and that is of institutional corruption. Lawrence Lessig of Stanford, formerly a lawyer known for his work on intellectual property, now at Harvard, he worked at the Safra Center. I was there for a year, and he's written about institutional corruption. He brought in a group to look at how this works, multiple areas. One was on pharmaceuticals, but in other areas, his own interest is in elections. So he defines institutional corruption as widespread systematic practices, usually legal, that undermine the institution's objectives, integrity, or effectiveness, and gives magnetic deviation as a metaphor. The compass is supposed to point true north. If a magnet is there, it's deflected. Something is not working with the institutional. He says, institutional corruption exists when there is systematic or strategic influence which is legal or currently ethical that undermines the institution's effectiveness by diverting it from its purpose or weakening its ability to achieve its purpose, including, to the extent relevant to its purpose, weakening either public's trust in that institution or the institution's trustworthiness. So there's a lot buried there, and then some talks I go in and look at each phrase, and one can do literature, but there are a couple of key points I want to focus on, and that is the idea of systematic or strategic influences that weaken the institution. One important source of this corruption can be improper dependence by the institution or its key actors on the actions of third parties that have fundamentally different interests. they can displace the institution's mission or weaken its functioning. Lessig likes to talk about campaign finance. You can't win in the general election unless you get the funds to run a campaign. Funding of campaign for the large contributions over $10,000 is made by corporations or individuals that are less than 0.1%. Unless you win that election selection, you don't pass to the popular vote. That weakens the democratic process, Lessig says. So he's launched a campaign to try to change that. And you can take that same analogy and to look at pharmaceutical firm dependence on the pharmaceutical industry for activities which where they have financial fundamentally different interests from the public. So what's the difference or relationship between conflicts of interest and institutional corruption? There's a literature on that, but I want to point out that often when we speak of conflicts of interest, we think of individual conduct or individual acts. Not always. There's a literature on institutional conflicts of interest, but the institutional corruption quite clearly puts the focus on the institutional's design, functioning, finance, and structure. How can we change those to avoid the problems or to address those problems, rather than to think it's a problem for an individual's conduct or barring one individual from being involved in decisions. And so I'd like to give 6 examples where I think we have improper dependence on the pharmaceutical industry, and that leads to weakening of institutions or deflecting them from its purpose. I'll list the 6 and then speak about each individually. First, we depend on pharmaceutical firms to set research and development priorities. Second, we depend on them to test whether drugs are safe and effective. Third, we rely on them to decide which data to disclose. Fourth, we expect them or hope that they will market drugs only for approved uses, approved by the registration authorities. 5, we rely on them to provide information on a drug's risks. And 6, we've relied on them, medical societies and society, to finance continuing medical education and also support other professional medical activities. So let's start for the ideas for research and development. The basic idea is that the public will provide incentives through patents, market exclusivity, and other kinds of grants for firms to go out and develop drugs without specifying or cueing those incentives to clinical areas or societal needs in any way. The motivations on firms is whatever brings profit or revenue. And as a result, we have incentives to create a lot of drugs that don't necessarily do much. Both the FDA and Prescria and other groups have at times looked at what's happened. And the FDA found that from 1990 to 2004, there were 1,284 drugs introduced in the US. They found that less than only 22% offered significant improvements. Only 14% were new medical molecular entities. The incentives seem to work to produce other drugs. That should raise some question about the incentives we created. Prescria has 2 articles on this at various times. From 1981 to 2001, they said that the new drugs, only 12% offered therapeutic advantage. In the 2002 to 2011 period, only 1.6% offered substantial advantage, 8% some advantage. Over 15% they found were more harmful than beneficial in acceptable drugs. Now, I think there we go. Okay. So we should think, I I think we need to think about changing the rules for patents, market exclusivity, and others to somehow reward production of drugs in a more sophisticated way than whatever is profitable for you and whatever you want. We might need to have public grants to fund research that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't find to be advantageous to do or do on its own. We might have to raise that through taxes on what the pharmaceutical industry does. And there's a literature on new business models for antibiotics because the industry doesn't seem to be putting research there, and the question of whether there's market failure. You can choose different examples, but the point is that we've assumed that the pharmaceutical industry will just come up with what society needs if we tell them you have profit to be made from it. Now, turn to the second issue, trials to test the safety of new drugs. Since the FDA in 1938 started requiring evidence of safety, particularly after 62 when they wanted evidence of effectiveness, the industry has been forced to do research to meet that burden. That's a big change that's much better than what happened before, where they didn't have to produce any evidence before they made marketing claims and introduced the drug on the market. But there still is the problem is that the FDA and society relies on them to do the research and to oversee the research. And we have a situation where the researchers are dependent on the firm that finances it. There's a very sophisticated literature that Professor United may be telling you about how the problems of certain studies are done. And when you tell the firm that has an interest in producing a certain result to do the research, there is a potential problem, and I think an actual problem. Now, there have been proposals in the 1990s to have the NIH or some other entity do it. Among those illustrious people who've talked about this are Dr. Marcia Angel, former New England Journal of Medicine editor, Dr. Jerry Avorn, who's the great drug safety person at Harvard. And what I found, though, is that this idea goes back to at least 1960, that there were hearings in the US at the Kefauver hearings that proposed this, that consumers report, the equivalent of Kishwasia, talked about not having the industry do the evaluation, that there was legislation introduced 10 years in a row from 1970 to 1980 to have something like this. And I analyzed the arguments there. I think they still hold up over time and the criticisms are wrong. So we can have the industry supply the funds, and at the stage of phase 2 or 3 trial, it then gets turned over to some other party. You still might have bad research. It just wouldn't be bad because the industry was looking for a result and researchers knew that, because they wouldn't be chosen and dependent, institutionally dependent for renewed contracts on the industry liking their results if you had the choices of the researchers and the design of the trials up to a neutral third-party entity. And when you look at trials for once drugs on the market, it's a little bit harder problem because there's no obligation yet for the industry to fund those trials. They do have that obligation for getting on the market. There we probably need to create a new source of funds. Industry often doesn't want to do head-to-head trials to compare drugs because it might make their drug not look so good. Other times they might, but do it in a way with changing dosages to make results different. Turn now to disclosing clinical trial data. We have a problem of publication bias. Industry would fund studies when they didn't come out in a favorable way for their product. Those were buried. When they came out favorably, they were published 2, 3, 4 times in different forms. And we thought, or some people thought, we'd solve the problem by registering clinical trials. Well, first, the medical journals insisted on this for a publication in the journal. NIH requires registration of certain trials. But what lawyers made a good contribution in their litigation against pharmaceutical firms. They unclosed the clinical study report and found that they were frequently at odds with what was published by the pharmaceutical firms, or even what was put in the registries. So the registry is the first step, but there's a much less costly and effective solution. Simply disclose the clinical study report for trials at the time of the submission. The EMA has moved away ahead of the FDA in making those available through freedom of information requests, but it's still cumbersome and not universal. And I think that's where we should go. I wrote with John Abramson on this and say we should think of the clinical study report as a public good that we should have access to. The industry, of course, says it's a trade secret and that they can't disclose that. Fourth problem, off-label usage. Now, it's illegal to market for off-label usage, but in most countries, and certainly in the US, doctors can prescribe for any use they want. I acknowledge that many off-label uses are reasonable, effective. So it's an odd category, and there are different kinds of off-label uses. But the studies by Radley and others found in the US that first, it's a large problem. About 21% of frequent drug usages are off-label. For some classes, it's over 50%. But most important, about 70% of off-label usage lack significant scientific report. How did he do this? He took samples at hospitals, found out what was used, and looked at the evidence for these various drugs. It's a fairly interesting series of articles. And I think the best I've seen in terms of empirical work. So if we have a problem, why does it occur? There are many reasons. Medical profession wants its clinical autonomy. There's a diversity of opinion. We've had legal changes in the US that allow certain off-label promotion, not the formal promotion, but under the guise of commercial free speech. The Supreme Court says the FDA can no longer bar discussion of off-label usage as it used to. And so firms often fund studies that are not very good, then disseminate those studies to doctors, mention them, it provides some kind of evidence, and when you send out millions or thousands of information on this, it can change practice. The key is, though, is that firms make money from this, and they have no incentive to warn doctors about the risks of off-label usages. Everyone from the detailer that earns their salary by discussing drugs gets bonuses, and they get the bonuses for off-label sales as well as on-label sales. So do the executives and the managers in the company with their stock options. We need three things, I think. First, we need to track off-label use. You can write on prescriptions what the diagnosis is, what the purpose. You can measure it and see where it's a problem. Second, you need to change the incentives. And so I would require manufacturers to fund studies, which they don't do now, of off-label usage. They may be very good. It would be useful to have that information. But why should a manufacturer spend money doing that if they can sell it without it? We can say it's not your marketing that did it, perhaps, but you're making money and we didn't authorize you to sell this for market for other usage. If you pass a threshold percentage or volume, we're going to take some money to study this because we want to find out whether it's safe and effective, and that's what you have to do to get a drug on the market anyway. I have a more radical proposal, if you accept that you may not accept. I'd say a lot of this problem would disappear if manufacturers didn't make money from off-label usage. So why not just say we're going to claw back funds that are over the marginal cost of production, and we'll put that in other kind of pharmaceutical research and development. Complicated to do, but I have in my article suggested a few steps on how it might be done. But definitely we need to track and study it. Secondly, we need to have studies funded by the industry. And third, perhaps we should remove the incentive. By the way, this is not how most lawyers talk. They talk about greater sanctions, more enforcement, other kinds of things, stronger penalties. And I followed that literature for years. We've found pharmaceutical companies have been fined billions of dollars in the US. It doesn't seem to change their practices on this, on off-label marketing. When you have a $3 billion fine and it doesn't do that, I think the whole incentive structure is wrong. Information on risks and benefits. So we've depended on firms to supply this information, but pharmaceutical representatives are not the best ones to be providing that information, whether it's Jerry Aborn looking at counter detailing as a way to counter misinformation, or Prescrire measuring what doctors have done in France. We found that the source of information from firms is not very good. Why do we rely on firms to do that? We need to fund other sources to provide information doctors. Since the medical representative has been created in the early 20th century, that's where most of their doctors get their information. And even if they don't, they're very effective of doing that and spend a lot of money on doing that. Sixth, the medical profession and society now has an unholy alliance with the pharmaceutical industry in depending on them to fund continuing medical education. Both in France, where l'Ordre des Médecins was opposed to any kind of oversight under the Loi Anti-Cadeau, and that would restrict kind of gifts. They wanted the funding. And in the US, when there were regulations created under the Anti-Kickback Act to consider certain kinds of gifts as equivalent of kickbacks, the AMA and all the medical societies got together and made comments on the regulatory process that aligned perfectly with the pharmaceutical industry. And they said, whatever you do, don't stop the industry from giving us funds. And of course, the government liked this too, because they thought it's cheap. Why should we pay for the money? I think that's a bad decision, because we end up paying for it anyway. It passed in on the cost of the drugs. If we're going to pay for it indirectly through what we pay pharmaceutical firms, let's fund that and have that funding go to where we want rather than where the pharmaceutical countries want. It's not just medical education, it's development of practice guidelines. There's a lot of evidence and documentation on the corruption of continuing medical education. Some of that's been cleaned up, but the choice of the topics is still up to whoever funds it. In the US, accredited medical education is required. There's no specification of what that should include. And only things that works, over half the funding is still comes from the industry. And guess what they choose? Things that might help them. In fact, let me just give one little side. It was the tradition for firms that provided continuing medical education to look for a supporter. They didn't say sponsor, supporter. And they go after one firm. So I asked people, why don't you get a panier, a group of firms? We couldn't do that. It might create a conflict of interest. The firms wouldn't know who we were working for. So I think we need to find a way to finance and break this institutional dependence on the industry. And I'm more interested now in not pointing fingers of individuals or particular things for conflicts of interest, but trying to think about how we create new institutions to avoid some of those problems. So if we have time, or you're interested later, I'd be glad to speak to you or answer your questions.